working in a social environment where you have to work in a strange way, a bit more appealing or at least appeasing psychologically than working at home where you have to constantly self-regulate and actually be your own boss. And that puts like psychological pressure on yourself, whereas like as you perfect example of the student going to the library, like that's a box and then, you know, I'm there, I'm at work, now I am work mode, I just have to do what my boss told me to do, or perform a certain amount of task in a certain amount of hours.
Yeah, 100%. But I think there's one important differentiation, because different people sort of people have individual differences in terms of how good they are in managing that autonomy. So some people, for example, they can work from home because they can just self-regulate well, or because they have learned to self-regulate well. For others, it's basically more, as you say, appealing or easier to go into a social context where they constrain their choices, and therefore they don't have to exert as much self-regulation to sort of manage themselves. And I think the other important part that comes out of it is that it's not enough to just give people autonomy. It's also important, and we will talk about leadership, it's also important to actually train them and sort of accommodate them to the levels of autonomy they have. Okay. So because too much autonomy can be as much of a problem as too little autonomy. Because if you tell to somebody who is not used to exercise autonomy, you can do whatever you want, they will be more stressed than helpful.
Okay. No, very good. And I know you've given an awful lot of interviews, and your research has been widely published and picked up by the media, especially in the context of hybrid working and in the context of like what seems to be happening now, which is like, you know, bring the people back in the office. Yeah. Now I know you've made, and we will continue that conversation, a couple of valid points as to why, you know, maybe 100% of one or 100% of the others is not the best solution. Yet, like, I was interested in one point of your research, which kind of like, again, would probably advocate for on-site working, which is that commuting has an important psychological dimension. And, you know, we obviously think of commuting as like moving from point A to point B. And your research demonstrates that actually there's more to that, and you know, there's benefit to that process, or to that time. Yeah. Can you explain that to us? Because that's obviously not something that we, you know, that would come naturally as a conclusion to most of us.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you summarized the hook of the study very nicely, because when we started this research, we were actually seeing that there is a lot of research published on the negative effects of commuting, especially when the commutes are stressful. And if you look at the traffic in Dublin, you sort of, we know what we're talking about when we say sort of stressful commute. So the predominant focus of the literature before our studies was that the commute is bad because it sort of puts pressure on us, time pressure, it's exhausting, it's demanding. But at the same time, what we also saw were sort of individual accounts of people. And this was especially during the pandemic, when people stopped commuting, actually, that they miss actually their commute. They said, oh, I actually like my commute because this is the opportunity for me to neither be in my sort of work environment, but also to not be in my home environment. And both environments have specific stressful demands that they can put on us. So what people do during the commute is maybe they sit in the car, they are sort of driving and they listen to a podcast, or they sort of sit in a train or in a bus and watch the scenery. And so this is what made us interesting in this phenomenon, to look at the potential positive side of commuting, because it can be actually used for recovery processes. So we studied different recovery processes that people can engage in during the commute. And one of the things that we found is that actually relaxing during one's commute can be really helpful, because it helps you to shake off the stress that you experience at work, while not having experienced any stress that you're going to have when you are at home. And I mean, obviously being at home is great, but if you have children, if you have a partner, you need to sort of, it can be stressful as well.
Tell me about it, yeah.
And then in that regard, we actually did the study where we actually show that the commute can have benefits. Now, obviously, these benefits, and people simulated their commute during the COVID pandemic. So they went around the house, they sort of tried to manage boundaries in that way. You don't have to commute to get this, but if you have to commute, it can be quite beneficial. So in that regard, it's sort of one of the psychological processes that can help people transition between different work and
different tasks.
Yeah.
And okay, that's interesting. And I guess that relates to what you also talk about your research, which is about like those micro moment and managing those moment, so that you can manage your stress throughout the day. And the commute is essentially could be associated to one of those moments in a way. But there are other ways to manage stress throughout the day, and I don't know if you want to delve into that. But I think what you were talking about there in the commute reminds me of this notion of mindfulness. So in other words, you need to kind of recenter on yourself and kind of like create a bit of a buffer zone between you and the environment, and in this case between two environments. But I think, in a way, it seems like organizations are kind of aware of like this, that people needs to look after themselves. But in your research or in your comments, you also show that like organizations don't necessarily go about the right way about addressing that need. Can you elaborate a bit?
Yeah, so you mentioned 2 points there, and one of the points is essentially what we see, and you mentioned mindfulness, for example, that there are these sort of big interventions that help people to cope with stress, and mindfulness-based meditation, or sort of these MBSR long courses are one way in which organizations try to support workers handling stress. And these ways are great, obviously, so they show some promise, but of course not for everyone, and it requires a lot of commitment from the employee. I mean, like mindfulness-based stress reduction training takes you normally a year. So you have to commit to a 1-year course, which is a great course. I mean, there is a lot of evidence that it works, but then the question is who can commit to that. So what we started to look at are more, we call them micro-interventions. So small things that you can do on a daily basis that can help you to cope with stress. So we looked at a 15 minutes mindfulness meditation and was an sample of nurses actually that can help them to self-regulate better and to sort of function and feel better at work. We looked at positive effect interventions, so funny videos. I mean, we talked about TikTok being a distraction, but looking at TikTok a little bit can actually also support you with self-regulating.
Don't say that. Don't say that. My children probably don't watch this show, but I think if you're telling us that like watching TikTok is you know is
funny things. on this.
funny things on TikTok.
And for a limited time. So our intervention
you,
was literally 3 minutes. So if you can constrain it to 3 minutes. But I get you. But I think maybe to move to the second part of the point you've made. And I also work with organizations to support them in sort of promoting well-being, reducing stress, and so on and so forth. And I think one of the characteristics that sort of, I don't want to say kept me awake at night, but sort of kept me busy is the fact that organizations very much focus on the what we call resource side of things, especially when it comes to the employee. So the idea is that organizations, when they do sort of stress, well-being interventions, try to give the employee some ways to deal with stress. So be it a mindfulness training, be it funny videos, be it gym classes, yoga, and this creates a bit of an impression like if it puts basically the onus on the employee. Precisely. So essentially, you exercise well, you go to the gym, you detach from work in the evening, you meditate in the morning, and then you should be okay,
regardless of how much work I put on you.
100%.
You know, this deadline is for tomorrow. If you're stressed, go for a run, watch like a couple of TikTok video, but in any case, I want this report by tomorrow morning.
And I did...
that's the attitude.
Yeah, exactly. And I worked with a company where we evaluated the training, and I said, yeah, but what about the demands? What about the actual pressures that people face? Because this is what the organization can also reduce. And they said, no, let's not talk about the demands. Let's talk about sort of how people can recover. Because obviously they don't want to mention it because then people become aware, oh, actually my work is so that stressful. I actually can't do it in an 8 hours. Can
manage without the stress. Like it is a stressful job. And that's okay.